Well, do you have it started for Ben to be able to cut off the beginning? And
Yeah, we are recording now, and so hopefully it all works right and I don't get fired.
okay. Well, I'll start us off with something. I'm sure Ben will probably put some sort of an intro on it, so I'll be minimal. But so I'll start us in three, two, one. Um, Welcome to Polity Matters, and today we are continuing our look at the BCO in Chapter 34, looking at special rules pertaining to process against a minister, teaching elder. So joining me is Scott. I am Jared Nelson, and Ben is not here. That's why you're not hearing him right now introduce that. But we do have a guest that can help us with his absence, and that is we are welcoming back again John Bise. So, John, know you from a former moderator and member of the SJC, but is there any fun facts that people don't know about you that you'd want to share right now?
Uh, I think all my secrets have been exposed.
Well, I do feel underdressed. I'm the only one without a bow tie today, so
Mm.
but we'll manage. Well, we're looking a little bit at 34, and instead of talking about things that happen at the session level with process, now this is going to be an area that often goes up on appeal to the SJC, which is for teaching elders, for a minister, and of course their court of original jurisdiction begins at the presbytery. And so I'm just going to read these sections and then we can comment a little bit about it. I might give some nerdy history. Scott can give us some analytics, and then John, you can give us your wisdom as always. So let's just go ahead and dive into this. So chapter 34, beginning with the first section here, reads, "Process against a minister shall be entered before the presbytery of which he is a member. However, if the presbytery refuses to act in doctrinal cases or cases of public scandal, and two other presbyteries request the General Assembly to assume original jurisdiction, to first receive and initially hear and determine, the General Assembly shall do so." So let's break this apart. Just the first sentence. What are we being told here? That process against the minister shall be entered before the presbytery of which he is a member. What does that mean, guys?
We're reminded that perhaps most importantly, where the jurisdiction of a pastor lies. His membership, we say this perhaps ad nauseum, is not in the local church, but actually in the presbytery. And so, process against a minister, it'd be inappropriate to begin in the local church because he is not a member of the local church. Instead, he is a member of the presbytery. And so, this is perhaps the framing, the introduction. If there are an issue that you might have with the minister, or if you've seen an issue with the minister, the appropriate place would be the presbytery to address those concerns. And so it perhaps is a little different because the pastor's on the ground at the church. You might think that's where I need to address my issues. But when it comes to sin and process, that actually begins in the presbytery, not the church.
Yeah, John, have you ever actually seen a session attempt to start process with a minister and not realize chapter 34:1 is there?
Yes, we've seen instances in which individuals try to bring charges against ministers at the at the session level, and that's simply reflective of the fact that many people simply fail to make that distinction that Scott noted. Of course, it's an interesting parallel to the fact that it's the presbytery that approves ultimately the call of the minister, even though the church makes the call, the presbytery nonetheless approves it and places the call in its hands.
I was at the Orthodox Presbyterian Church Presbytery meeting last week, and what I learned there is that the ministers are members of the churches of the region. And so no matter what church they attend in that presbytery, they are members of that church, as all the churches in the presbytery, which is somewhat unique. It's not merely the presbytery they're a member of, but their membership has a dual focus in every congregation within its bounds, which I thought is perhaps peculiar at least on my ears.
I think this might be a difference between the PCUS and the PCUSA, the Northern and Southern Presbyterians, but Since ours is copied off of the PCUS BCO, that's where our membership is. The second part of this is maybe gets into a little bit more detail and more interesting elements because it's not in the PCUS BCO, but it is in the PCA BCO, which is this provision if a presbytery refuses to act in cases of public scandal or doctrinal issues, and if two other presbyteries petition the General Assembly to assume original jurisdiction, that the General Assembly takes up original jurisdiction. I had noted in the previous episode that we did some of the history of this. In the old PCUS, there was a professor named E.T. Thompson who was going to be brought up, was teaching at Union Theological, and a lot of students were coming away from there with more liberal views, and there were several presbyteries that were concerned about this. So at least four different presbyteries overtured the General Assembly to do something about it because they felt that the presbytery was not doing anything. And those failed because the original 34-1 was just one sentence. And the understanding was, well, that's his court of original jurisdiction. You can't take him out of there. Although they also said, hey, we investigated him and everything's fine. We're not going to start process on this. And so when the PCA came into existence, this was ringing in their heads, and they added this provision. John, maybe you can tell us, have you ever seen this provision in use? I know there was an attempt a couple years ago to use it, but maybe you can fill us in a little bit on that.
Well, let me just go a little beyond what you said, because in addition to that case, there was another one, predecessor, and I'm sorry, I don't have the strength of recollection, but there was also a predecessor case in the former church where that came into play, and ultimately efforts to have the assembly take up those matters failed, even though there was an assertion by a man who I believe subsequently became part of the PCA that it was the responsibility of the assembly to speak to matters of theology and polity. And so that argument was placed. But yes, there have been efforts in recent years, and there have also been over the years a number of instances in which, because cases either have not gone to the SJC or were turned away, there have been efforts to modify the BCO to change this from two presbyteries to some greater number. There's also been debate over whether the phrase refuses to act means takes no action or fails to take an appropriate action. So, this couple of little lines are laden with, or I guess the couple is laden with areas of dispute that have had a history, both in a recent case, but as well as several others over the years.
Yeah, there was a recent effort at an overture to change this, and it basically the compromise was not knowing what refuses to act really meant. Can we find that as to refuses to start process or adjudicate or something? But if you're going to change that, others said you don't want to have a witch hunt happening. Two presbyteries start petitioning to have all these people brought up on original jurisdiction, and so to change that to 10%. Some people thought, well, should it be 5% or should it be something different? And so that compromise, ultimately, they couldn't really find the right balance there. Maybe somebody will try that in the future. But this is an interesting provision in that if this were to be engaged, you would have a trial at the SJC level, the GA level, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, something T. David Gordon pointed out, I was talking to him about this, that scared him a little bit is you have no court of appeal. So if this happens, it's SJC and you have no appeal from there. That's your only court, unless of course we institute synods, which I know Scott is all for, right?
No, I hate synods. Terrible idea. More bureaucracy. No, no, no.
Jared, you're correct in reciting that. I looked it up, and it was the 2022 assembly at which that last effort was made, and it involved work between Howie Donahoe and Fred Greco, who frequently come at things from different directions, but the goal was to try to come with something reasonable, because some feel that two is an unreasonably small number given the expanded number of presbyteries since that was originally drafted in. But then if it's got to be more than two, how many more? And as you said, things really broke down both over what's the appropriate number or percentage of presbyteries, but also there was dispute over what is it that constitutes refusal to act.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what ultimately sank that in the presbyteries was that there are many presbyteries that are so small that 10% becomes a single church. And is that that would be even lightening the stipulation. And so I think it got a majority of the presbyteries, but nowhere near the threshold to actually be considered again. And it is probably largely due to the fact of the sessional issue of presbytery taking original jurisdiction from a session. And being in a small presbytery, I was surprised my presbytery voted for it, even though we only have 9 churches. A fraction of a church has to send it up, and we'll take original
Yeah.
jurisdiction.
Yeah, because this was parallel to 33-1 that deals with
hmm
this at the session level. If there's a church that
But
you're taking something out of there. And so we like to have it even. So both of those were being amended, and um, people were pointing that out about 33-1. You know. Anything else that we need to talk about here with 34-1?
John, can you define what fails or refuses to act means
well,
definitively?
no, I can't define it definitively. As I said, there's been dispute about that fairly broadly as to whether it means does nothing or doesn't take the appropriate action. And so that was part of the discussion that went on a couple of years ago, and that has been going on for quite some time. It goes all the way back to the issue in the previous denomination.
In history, I think this has only really been activated once in the Woods case back in 99 or 2000, somewhere in that. And more recently, it was seeming like it was going to happen, but actually, that's not how the case that some people were trying to use 34-1 got before the SJC. So it hasn't been used a whole lot. Maybe it's partly because that's confusing. So,
Yeah. The Woods case preceded my time on the SJC. I've taken a look at some of the information, but it arose in that, and then more recently in another notorious case.
yeah. Well, maybe we can move on to 34-2. There we read, as no minister ought, on account of his office, to be screened in his sin or slightly censured, so scandalous charges ought not to be received against him on slight grounds. What is this trying to do for a process that would begin against a teaching elder, against a pastor?
Smith notes that it's trying to deal with two dangers. That is, a presbytery dealing too lightly with an offense, and perhaps a presbytery on the second accepting charges against a minister too lightly. And so a presbytery will be tempted to either dismiss legitimate charges or perhaps take frivolous charges too seriously. And that's perhaps it's a really short section, but really difficult to apply just because you're trying to avoid both ditches of trying to perhaps maintain justice in the court. So it warns us on those two things. Don't deal with an offense too lightly, and don't accept light offenses or frivolous offenses too seriously.
Yeah, what's the principle there? Because we wouldn't charge somebody in the congregation with doctrinal cases on some things that we would charge a pastor for doctrinal cases. So in some ways, the standard is higher. We would charge more for a pastor. But how do we know if we're getting into an area in which we're being too nitpicky on a charge, or we're brushing something under the rug. Is there any kind of principle or any examples that we can think of?
I would say that the two principles that I would look to would be the one of whether or not the matter poses risks either to the vitals of religion or to the reputation of the church. Some things are simply matters of personal weakness and are of, I hate to say trivial because they could still be sinful, but they're sins that do not have substantial impact. And so, that kind of a situation would not require a trial. On the other hand, you don't want to overlook something that, even though it may not have drama associated with it, if you will, that has significant adverse impact on the name of Christ, the reputation of the church, and the like. And the same would hold true from a theological perspective with regard to the teaching, as it striketh the vitals. Mm-hmm. And Scott, I'll go ahead and anticipate your question and tell you that I can't give you a definitive answer as to what strikes at the vitals.
And certainly not paedo communion, right?
God wants to touch every third rail he can.
So. Yeah, I'm going to touch all the third rails.
All right. Well, if Waters was here, he would talk about it comes down to the judgment and subjection of the courts, but we'll just move on since he's not. 34:3 reads, if anyone knows a minister to be guilty of a private offense, he should warn him in private. But if the offense be persisted in or become public, he should bring the case to the attention of some other minister of the presbytery. So back to our distinctions of private and public. How do we know, though, when a private matter has been persisted in and is worthy to be brought up or has become public? What does that mean? Because if I put it on Twitter, has that become public? Is that what it's getting at?
I think there again, it's a matter of judgment of the court and of the individual who might potentially bring a claim. If I knew of something concerning in your theology or practice, Jared, I might call upon Scott, and first I might warn you privately. Then I might call upon Scott to assist me in that process. But if it persisted, or if it began, I think if it made it into the public realm, if you will, by social media, there's a reasonable likelihood that should be viewed as being public.
Anything to add to that, Scott, or are we good?
I think we're good. We talk about private and public offenses quite a bit already.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Then moving on to 34:4. There's an A and a B. I'll read A first. When a minister accused of an offense is found contumacious, which we see a reference back to 32:6 there, he shall be immediately suspended from the sacraments and his office for his contumacy. Record shall be made of the fact and of the charges under which he was arraigned, and the censure shall be made public. The censure shall in no case be removed until the offender has not only repented of his contumacy, but has also given satisfaction in relation to the charges against him. We've heard language that's very similar to this, but this is a provision that tells us if somebody is contumacious, that is, they are persisting in this, they are not cooperating with the court, they're not entering into this process, that they are at some point suspended from office and suspended from the sacraments. So any comments on what this looks like or how to know when this comes into effect? Scott,
contumacy, is, the persistence. And so I think that this is really a situation where I would think that for the most part, it would be the presbytery that would be aware of the facts that would drive the case. But it's striking to me that, that immediately upon a finding of contumacy, a minister is to be suspended both from the sacraments and his office. So, and the censure shall be made public. So, I would think that before that provision were activated, a presbytery would have very strong indications and very significant bases for doing so. In one sense, it goes back to the issue of 34.2 that you don't want to do this lightly.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. It's a good reminder that this is in the context of process, not anywhere else. And so you can't just find a member in good standing with no charges against him, contumacious, because he's a knucklehead for saying something you didn't like at Presbytery. This
Right.
is within the context of trials and leading up to trials. And so once process is engaged, the court itself has the power to cite and to force participation of someone who's been accused of something, and it's failure to participate that often leads to the contumacious verdict. And that's where you get at perhaps the end of A, where it's not only when they have repented of their contumacy that this begins to reverse, but also is given satisfaction to the charge. And so there are two issues that at play here. It's not only you jump to a new ladder with dealing with the contumacy, they must first repent of that, and then you have to get back to the original issue that led to the contumacy in the first place. And both of those are seeking to be resolved before perhaps even removing all of these censures being dealt with. And so it's not as there's a little more going on in 34.4 relating to those things.
Right. On A, it seems to also be worth taking note the difference between suspended and the actual deposition or excommunication. In some ways, you're on an on-ramp there, but you can get off of that if they start participating with the process. But then B, it has a provision if they don't cooperate with that. It says, if after further endeavor by the court to bring the accused to a sense of his guilt, he persists in his contumacy, he shall be deposed and excommunicated from the church. Any thoughts there on how long is that endeavor supposed to be?
As Guy Waters would say, it's at the discretion of the court. And as John Bise would say, it's at the discretion
At
of
the
the court.
discretion of the court.
Yeah.
And I think that would be driven by, such issues as the significance of the offense. How long did it go before it became public? And what are the outward evidences of repentance, as well as the passage of time? And I think in these cases, what the court is really charged with doing is protecting both the purity of the church, but also the purity of the reputation of Christ and of the church. So in a restoration situation like that, it's both valid to be cautious. On the other hand, it should not be an impossible task.
Well, we've had for an answer a lot, the discretion of the court, but 34.5, I think, continues in that a bit with a really interesting section in my mind that some of our rules are not just a black and white 1-0. You're going to have to make some judgments here, but 34.5 says, heresy and schism may be of such a nature as to warrant deposition, but errors ought to be carefully considered, whether they strike at the vitals of religion and are industriously spread, or whether they arise from the weakness of the human understanding and are not likely to do much injury. So not all heresy, not all schism, not all doctrinal error is the same. And there's some discretion that's here. What are we looking for here over if we catch wind of something that was said in a sermon that was disturbing, or something that was written in a position paper of a pastor or article How do we make a distinction here of whether or not this rises to a level in which it needs to be pursued and whether it's not really something that's subject for deposition, perhaps to say, there's an admonition here, but not deposition.
Once again, I think we're talking about matters of discretion, but I think that um, the issue of striking at the vitals is a significant one. There's certain things that we could list, issues, that would challenge or deny the deity of Christ, that would deny, the sufficiency of his work, things of that nature would clearly fall into this category. On the other hand, there may be some that are simply, misunderstandings of Scripture, misapplications, things that are inconsistent, and which, frankly, they're probably items that are taught that simply an individual congregant might not even pick up on the fact that it's contrary to Scripture. Mm-hmm. Certainly, if you've got something that's of a secondary or tertiary nature such as that, then simply going to the man and speaking with him privately about it is the thing that's called.
Yeah, we actually had to deal with this provision once in our presbytery. I'll be careful exactly what I say, but it was for a document that was just before our presbytery. And there was real concerns about how things were worded and things that actually dealt with Christology. And as we worked our way through it, realized that the minister had no intention of saying the things which we thought were natural and logical consequences of what he said. It really was just a not understanding the logic of what he was saying, worked with the committee, reworded everything. And 34.5 was one of the things that stopped us from really engaging in charges right away, because we just said, wait a minute, this perhaps is just poorly worded, and nobody really knows about it except us here at Presbytery. So if we could deal with it here, and you're not going to say this in public, I think we're going to be fine. So it's good to have that discretion available to you, so that every bad word choice doesn't bring you up on charges.
Yeah. And that goes to the issue of whether or not it's being industriously spread. Mm-hmm. If this is a discussion among pastors, and someone floats a topic that he's been considering, that he's struggling with, that's a whole different item from someone flaunting something that is clearly contrary to our standards, campaigning within his congregation and the presbytery to get folks to modify their views. So, discretion once again.
Yep. Well, 34.6 continues. If the presbytery find on trial that the matter complained of amounts to no more than such acts of infirmity as may be amended, so that little or nothing remains to hinder the minister's usefulness, it shall take all prudent measures to remove the scandal. This almost seems like to be 34.5, but in the midst of the trial, you kind of discover this to say, okay, maybe this did touch on the vitals of religion, but now it's amended wording. It's something that can be changed, and it's not something that is an error that's really deeply held and continued. And there is an off ramp to process there, it seems. Anything further to say on that? All right, 34.7. When a minister pending a trial shall make confession, if the matter be base, and you're going to have to help me with this word. This is 1800s wording here. Flagitious, such as drunkenness, uncleanness, or crimes of a greater nature. However penitent he may appear to the satisfaction of all, the court shall without delay impose definite suspension or depose him from the ministry. So here we have some sins that you can't just say, well, you can amend that, just stop drinking so much. I guess if it's several acts of drunkenness in public or something like that, some things can't be amended. And even if you promise not to do it again, remove the scandal.
What's
Anything else that we should?
interesting, what's interesting here is the shall, without delay, impose a definite suspension that the court is mandated, according to the book here, to actually render a verdict, and in that verdict include at least a definite suspension. And so if a minister comes forward with the sins that you just outlined, you'd think of like a 6 month suspension, a year suspension, 2 year suspension. It has to be definite in some sort. Or even if it's a greater issue, the deposition itself. But the court doesn't seem to have the liberty to just merely admonish in this regard. It seems that the court must, even if there is great remorse, institute one of these two censures.
And I think that's reflective of the notion that there are sins which are particularly onerous, which particularly harm the reputation of the church and the reputation of Christ, and that regardless of the depth of one's repentance, something is demanded in the way of reaction and response to that. And that's why this is here.
Well, it is helpful if you're looking at somebody that, you have a minister that confesses that they were guilty of that DUI they were pulled over for, or something like that. There's immediate action that has to be taken there, even while the matter's pending here, if they're making a confession of it. So 34.8. If we continue on here, a minister under indefinite suspension from his office or deposed for scandalous conduct shall not be restored, even on the deepest sorrow for his sin, until he shall exhibit for a considerable time such an eminently exemplary, humble, and edifying life and testimony as shall heal the wound made by his scandal. A deposed minister shall in no case be restored until it shall appear that the general sentiment of the church is strongly in his favor and demands his restoration, and then only by the court inflicting the censure or with that court's consent. The removal of deposition requires a 3/4 vote of the court inflicting the censure, or a 3/4 vote of the court to which the majority of the original court delegates that authority. So what is this? If somebody has been deposed or they've been indefinitely suspended, what sort of guidance are we getting here for the person that's asking for restoration?
I think in part what we're getting is that it should be, only with great caution. There should be a period of exemplary behavior, and it's interesting to me that the comment is made that it should appear that the general sentiment of the church is strongly in his favor. Our belief is that these sorts of things are injurious to the church and to the name of Christ by virtue of the assault, if you will, on the reputation of the church. Therefore, if the church demands or is willing to receive a man back, I think that's indicative of the restoration of reputation, if you will, and the feeling that the reputational harm that had been inflicted has been in large part abated by subsequent exemplary behavior. It's interesting that the last sentence of 34.8 is something that I believe is a relatively new addition to the book. Mm-hmm. That sentence was not there prior to, I think it came in 2013 or 2014. At the 2013 General Assembly, the 41st, Pacific Northwest brought an overture which sought the removal require a 2/3 vote of the court inflicting the censure, or a 2/3 vote of a court to which oversight of the censure had been assigned by majority vote of the original court. That, in the course of the assembly, was amended and became a three-quarters vote. But I think that arose out of some cases in which ministers were restored with relatively modest margins, um, supporting that restoration. And so Pacific Northwest brought this up as a concern that it should be more than a simple majority.
And I have my suspicions of who that might have originally written that overture. But it does tell us, I think, that it doesn't seem like this provision has the idea that somebody who's deposed from office is just being deposed and a couple of years later he comes back. It feels like there's a provision for your restoration, but there really needs to be a lot of factors involved with a considerable amount of time, that there's not lasting wounds, that the whole church is really welcoming this. It probably shouldn't be the pattern. It's more the exception that you find somebody that has been deposed because of scandal that comes back into the ministry.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, what you see in this section is a life, a humble life, that is not engaged in leadership, not engaged in the ministry as a leader at all. It's you've sat in the pew and have not sought the ministry, and it seems that the church itself, you know, the outward call, the external call, is being placed back in there by the church, not by the individual. And so I think that's where perhaps the three-fourths is helpful, that it's not merely the man who feels called back, it's that the church itself is almost demanding him back, based on all the evidences that are outlined here. And so it's a truly exceptional circumstance, as John had talked about previously, with the damage that scandal can do when a minister falls. To demand him back is an extraordinary circumstance. And that extraordinary circumstance, I think, is outlined pretty clearly and well in 34:8.
Well, if we're ready to move on to 34:9,
Mm-hmm.
here we read, when a minister is deposed, his pastoral relation shall be dissolved. But when he is suspended from office, it shall be left to the discretion of the presbytery whether the censure shall include the dissolution of the pastoral relation. What's going on here?
You can no longer be a pastor of a church if you're not a pastor. And the deposed part meant, and the suspended part, if it's a definite suspension, it might just be a limited time and that censure might be removed. And so the relation need not be needlessly dissolved depending the offense. What I find interesting here is that the presbytery actually has the authority to somewhat unilaterally dissolve the relation of a suspended minister without the perhaps concurrence of the congregation. And so this is helpful in our polity to remember that while the church might call upon the presbytery to call a man, it's up to the presbytery to actually issue that call. And in the same way, the presbytery has the authority to dissolve said call in the midst of process, without the church. The church may not want that person as their pastor, but it's ultimately up to the presbytery in those circumstances. Even if they want him, they might not think it's wise to still have him. And so there is perhaps a Presbyterianism clearly on display in 34:9.
Mm-hmm.
I think it reflects the notion that it is the presbytery not only of which the pastor is a member, but that the presbytery is exercising its oversight with regard to its care for the individual churches. We can easily envision a situation in which a beloved pastor has a congregation that might want to overlook something that the congregation might think was a light matter, but the presbytery, thinking it more substantial, more potentially harmful to either the peace and purity of the church or to the reputation of the church and of Christ, would insist that the relationship be dissolved. And so there's protection against potentially the congregation treating a pastor too lightly, if you will.
Anything more to add on this? 3410. Whenever a minister of the gospel shall habitually fail to be engaged in the regular discharge of his official functions, it shall be the duty of the presbytery at a stated meeting to inquire into the cause of such dereliction and, if necessary, to institute judicial proceedings against him for breach of his covenant engagement. If it shall appear that his neglect proceeds only from his lack of acceptance to the church, presbytery may, upon the same principle upon which it withdraws license from a licentiate for lack of evidence of his divine call, divest him of his office without censure, even against his will, a majority of 2/3 being necessary for this purpose. In such a case, the clerk shall, under the order of the presbytery, forthwith deliver to the minister concerned a written note that at the next stated meeting, the question of his being so dealt with is to be considered. This notice shall distinctly state the grounds for this proceeding. The party thus notified shall be heard in his own defense, and if the decision shall pass against him, he may appeal, and if he has been tried after the usual forms. This principle may apply with any necessary changes to ruling elders and deacons. What is 3410? What's the circumstances in which 3410 is trying to give us some sort of a solution? What's the problem to which 3410 is the solution?
I think it's basically a pastor who is lazy and who's not fulfilling the call to the pastorate. It may be that he's simply not preparing well to be in the pulpit. It may be that he's not caring for his flock. And that could be in any number of ways. It could be pastoral care. It could be, his own behavior personally. But it strikes me that for the most part, as I read this, it seems to be simply a matter of a man not doing a reasonable job and failing so miserably that it's clear that it's not, that it's impacting the health of the church, and that he's simply not applying himself.
Yeah, it seems the first part of that definitely has that in mind, and judicial proceedings then would be brought against him. Though it also seems to have another possibility that's out there. Maybe we call this the Charles Simeon possibility. If it shall appear that his neglect proceeds only from his lack of acceptance to the church. I wonder if this is, I don't know if you know the story of Charles Simeon, that he had leaders in his church that didn't want him there, locked the pews so that people couldn't sit in the pews for evening worship, just didn't want him there. And I suppose this would be some sort of there's a provision that this may not be the fault of the person. Maybe they just don't like, his football team or something like that. I don't know. But there may be a non-fault sort of reason for them to divest a person, that the church just didn't accept him and doesn't want him in that role anymore. And so it's not necessarily his fault, his laziness. I don't know that I've necessarily seen that in a church, but yeah.
What I find interesting is that it's divestiture, not deposition. And so it's a little different in regards to becoming a pastor again. It's not the same, perhaps, threshold of reversal, where we were just talking about that demanded a 3/4 resolution, a simple majority. He could come under care of another presbytery. And so it's just removing the credentials without censure. And so it's a little easier to get back in under this circumstance than the circumstance we've been discussing a few moments ago. Have you ever seen this applied, John?
I've not seen it applied. I've seen instances when we see church members who are unhappy with pastors, and sometimes that relates to their perception as to how a pastor is performing. But to me, this is clearly a situation where the presbytery takes action. Interestingly, 3410 doesn't say anything about how this action is prompted. I could envision a situation in which disgruntled members of a congregation might go to the presbytery and say, Pastor Smith is simply not performing as he should, and ask that the presbytery approach him or something of that sort. But I can't recall a situation in which I've seen a case that grew out of this. The second paragraph talks about the fact that the party notified of that concern has the opportunity to be heard in his own defense, and he may appeal the decision. So it has a judicial element in the sense of appeal. But
Yeah, this has to be one of those provisions that made its way into the book at some point because things like this happened. And you just have to imagine for a 3410 situation in a presbytery to occur that there's such a breakdown in the relationship between the pastor and the congregation. It's one of the times in which you are thankful for Presbyterianism that can step in and hopefully find some sort of a resolution there.
interesting too that the final sentence that it may apply with any necessary changes to ruling elders and deacons.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So pastors aren't the only ones that can get lazy.
You better hasten yourself, John. You don't do enough on the SJC. We're coming with you with this provision.
I think everybody on the SJC should be exempt from this because they do more work than I think anybody else in the denomination.
3410 against you.
It's been a rather busy season.
So you're saying if John doesn't read those 1,000-page briefs that we can't use this provision?
Well, is there any final thoughts or pastoral wisdom about 34 in the BCO that we want to say before we sign off?
I'll come back to where we started. This whole chapter to me really hinges on a couple of things. It really drives home the issue that the pastor or pastors plural are charged with living lives that are exemplary in their holiness and piety, and that they're to be held to a high standard. On the other hand, we need to be cautious that, as Scott characterized it, we not drive into either ditch, that of being overly light and indulging sin, nor that of being unduly picky in pursuing sins that are of minimal impact and may simply be a matter of human frailty.
Well, I'll end a little bit differently in saying, as Thomas Murphy may say, this podcast is over. Thomas Murphy, who wrote a pastoral theology that Law College just came out with that I've been reading through, which is amazing and will make you feel like a lazy pastor if you start reading through it of all the duties that you have as a pastor. So on that note, thank you so much, John Bise, for being with us again, giving us some wisdom on this. Thank you, Scott, for being with me, and we'll see if Ben makes it back from wherever he's at for our next episode. He'll add a little tag on the end here for all the things that I'm forgetting to say about where to find us and all those sorts of things. So thank you, and say goodbye, gentlemen.
Goodbye.
Jared and Scott, thank you, and thanks to Ben for the work that you're doing with this, and thanks for having me. It's fun to be with you, and I appreciate the fact that you're providing this source of knowledge to the broader church. I actually had a fellow in our officer training class come up to me a couple of days ago, and he said, I was listening to the podcast, and lo and behold, there you were.
Well, thanks for the encouragement, and thanks for everybody for listening. Thanks.
Take care. Bye, man.